Great. So I forgot, this is Dr. Rita Morais. Me-dérive, I'm not sure, Toronto, a participatory archiving NAR. I'll let Dr. Morais tell you a little bit more about it, but we're going to explore the intersections between participatory archiving and augmented reality, or AR, rooted in the necessity to engage more fully with Toronto's historical and diverse cultural heritage. The first visual archive of Toronto's diverse historical narratives, using community archiving and in the hands of the publicly and crowdsourced records onto their on-site specific locations. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and Dr. Morais will begin.
That's great. Thanks, Curtis. So the 2020 proverb, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yep.
Perfect. All right. Good evening, everyone. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Rita Morais. I'm a Toronto-based academic educator and administrator, currently holding the position of chair at George Brown College's School of Design here in Toronto. I wanted to thank the lovely team at Civic Tech TO for having me join the impressive roster of folks who shared their work as part of the Civic Hacknight series. This past October, I defended my dissertation at Ryerson University in the Communication and Culture program, where I spent about 7 years investigating the intersections between mobile media, cultural heritage, and memory, culminating in my SSHRC-funded research creation project, Meteor of Toronto, an augmented reality counter-archive of Toronto's historical urban environments. With that, I'd like to thank you for your time and participation as I present my work on what is known as participatory archiving and augmented reality. Quick anecdote about this slide. I live in Little Portugal here in Toronto, and this photo is one of the only archival images that reflects Dundas Street West at my intersection. It was taken almost 87 years ago to the day, and I look at it often while it's out of frame of the Zoom call. I have a large plexi version of it sitting on a shelf just above me. It was part of an installation that I did that Sam was also a part of at the design exchange known as the City of Experiences. So this sort of interesting dichotomy for me is that I look at this photo every day and I see this sort of space when I leave my door, and it serves as a sort of reminder of the ways in which a city's narrative can change over a century. And so I wanted to use my presentation with you today to do a few different things. The first thing is I wanted to talk a little bit about the tracing of the origins of the project, so how I got interested in it, then look a little bit about this sort of triad of what is in the archive, where that archive is located, and then how the archive itself is accessed. And then finally, I'll provide a bit of an overview of the contributions that are made by my research and give a bit of a conclusion and then start with a Q&A. So I think often people who I talk to ask me about my work, tending to sort of focus on what inspired the project itself. So I think that's a good place for us to start. So Meteor of Toronto is the first augmented reality visual archive of Toronto's diverse historical narratives. And it's sort of this portmanteau of the word mediation and the situationist notion of the dérive, which is this sort of technique of passing or drifting. In this way, the sort of app produces a new paradigm to what we conceive of as traditional archives, one that is simultaneously participatory and also informed by the technical. Meteor of Toronto mobilizes archival power away from the institution and into the hands of the actual public, coding found and crowdsourced records onto their site-specific locations. Now, my interest and intervention into this project came in 3 forms and 3 phases. The first is rooted in personal interventions and sort of personal affinity and nostalgia. My family and I arrived in Canada by way of Portugal in 1989, benefiting from the 1976 Immigration Act. Now, I was too young to remember our arrival here, but my mom has a series of photos that serve as personal archival records. There are post photos in front of the CN Tower, the York Municipal offices where my sister would later work, and at Portugal Day parades here on Dundas Street West. Decades after these photos were taken, I've come to realize that these are sort of historical records of the ways in which many immigrants move through and characterize Toronto's urban spaces. In short, they serve as reminders of the significant cultural identities that exist across the city And I believe that these records and these memories are sort of underutilized pieces of memory that sort of contribute to our idea of witnessing and belonging for immigrants across the city. So this idea sort of reared itself when I was doing my doctoral work through this sort of investigative analysis of cultural cartography. So I wrote a paper about the ways in which we sort of reimagine spaces through technology. And I actually focused on the cultural heritage sector, looking at apps like London Street Museum and Montreal Urban Museum that allowed you to sort of mobilize records from within these institutions onto public space. And so I thought about doing a potential project like this in Toronto, but much to my surprise, when I went to the archives, particularly the Toronto Archives, Archives of Ontario, and then Library and Archives Canada, I noticed that so many of the narratives that were found in those archives didn't actually reflect the sort of idea of diversity that we come to know as synonymous with Toronto. And so chasing this idea of having technology that affords X-ray vision and simultaneously time traveling abilities, which I confess is a sort of product of too much sci-fi for me, I created Meteor of Toronto as a sort of intervention grounded in participatory counter-archival solutions to the lack of immigrant and marginalized narratives that are found in our official memory banks. So this work has subsequently been fueled by what I refer to as the archival impulse. And so the archival impulse for me makes itself pronounced specifically as we see bars, restaurants, developers, real estate companies, et cetera, using archival content to tell a story about a space. So oftentimes you'll see this sort of archival record in space, and then it's supposed to contribute some understanding about a neighborhood, about a person, or about an event. So with that, I'd like to discuss a sort of overview of the project and some of the contributions that it makes. So I'll begin by foregrounding me-dérive of Toronto as research creation. So I'm not sure how many academics are on this call, but typically when we think about research that's done sort of in graduate school, you really have a bit of a sort of passive form of research. And essentially what that means is you're writing about something, or you're sort of coming up with an original thesis on something, but oftentimes it's not sort of an active application of that research. And so what that means is that you're doing a lot of telling rather than merely showing. Now, I kind of wanted to flip this idea on its head. I wanted to point out where I saw the gaps and omissions in institutional archives, and then also present a bit of a solution for them. Now, this is known as research creation because you're actually doing the research, and then inadvertently you're creating something using that research that you found. So in the case of me-dérive of Toronto, the research was and is largely rooted in acquiring the content, or in this case, the records that are found within the digital archive that provide for the augmented site-specific experiences for the user. It also meant that I had to do investigative research on available platforms, augmented reality software development kits, and systems used to actually develop the app itself. The knowledge and the research were acquired in tandem with the actual build out of the app. Now, there's too many phases to focus on here, but of significance, the project encompassed fostering an acquisition and collection model to guide content procurement. So essentially what that means is I looked at the content that was missing from the archives and then created a really detailed list on the things that I was looking for, that I was hoping folks would submit for, and subsequently that I was going out and seeking out. I also created an image submission platform and a website to actually sort of host some of that content as well. And then subsequently, the content was mapped and coded into space using augmented reality. And I didn't do that work myself. I worked on the UI for the app, but I worked with a programmer who helped me sort of bring the project to life. It's worth noting that the content has been coded in two critical phases. The first is reflective of found photographs that are within our institutional archives, as well as those that are found in daily newspapers, as well as in diverse and grassroots organizations. And then the second phase encourages folks to submit their own records in order to expand our sentiments of belonging across Toronto. So both of these phases are in an ongoing state of progression. And even though I've sort of defended the project and finished my doctoral work, I'm still continuing to work on the project. So the final project and the final sort of product here includes information about access, navigation, and use, as well as an image database, a topographical map, and a series of coded augmented reality experiences. So me-dérive of Toronto is made up of crowdsourced photographs taken by citizens and visitors to Toronto alike. In the user's sort of movements and explorations across the city, they foster an effective gaze towards their immediate environments, drawing connections and interacting with space and historical narratives in new ways. While users may be distant from the time in which a photo was taken or the creator of the photograph themselves, they enter into a relationship with both the image and the creator as they analyze what once was in juxtaposition to what now is. So analyzing historical content, whether it's text-based, visual, or ephemeral in nature, requires the participant to look anew. Users may identify people and places lurking within the images. They may identify an old bar, a church, a storefront owned by or frequented by a distant relative, friend, or colleague. They may encounter a historical organization, an establishment, or a protest on their route to work, which inadvertently alters how they perceive that respective space altogether. Now, Meteor of Toronto draws on the parallels between photography and memory and uses participatory methodologies, like the idea of having a user submission, as well as augmented reality, in an effort to provide a more fertile and accessible realm for collection practices. So we can see that the sort of idea around the digital has sort of disrupted how we perceive the archive. And for me, this is sort of tackled through this three-pronged approach. So the first is the idea of what is actually in the archive. So what are the things that I was looking at that were found within the archive? Where is that archive located? So for example, when you sort of create an augmented reality archive, where does it live? And then subsequently, how do you actually access that archive? And so I think it's important to just start and overview really quickly what is in the archive. So this sort of query and overall understanding helped me to sort of analyze the fact that a lot of our institutional archives, they are sort of reflective of social norms. And so they sort of mediate relationships that we have with society. They influence knowledge of the knowable past. And at times, they sort of serve to perpetuate injustice paradigms. So my research makes clear that across the city and the nation more broadly, these archives do not mirror our contemporary multicultural reality. They fail to reflect demographic changes that have been made possible by reform on immigration. So the photos from the Library and Archives Canada, the Archives of Ontario that you see here, as well as the Toronto Archives, hold within them very, very small collections of Toronto's changing urban fabric in alignment with the significant eras of immigration patterns. So essentially, what does that mean? When we look at when Toronto sort of had these major sort of periods of immigration, particularly from Europe, as well as Central and South America, Asia and Africa, and the Caribbean and Bermuda, we're seeing these like large influxes, but unfortunately our archives aren't sort of catching up and matching with that content. One thing that is really, really clear though, is that a lot of our institutional, or sorry, newspaper archives do a really good job of sort of covering deep issues around social inclusion, poverty, housing, cultural events, demonstrations, and parades alike that are sort of respective of Toronto. And so these sort of organizations, including the Toronto Telegram and the Toronto Star, they do a really, really good job of sort of providing an authentic representation of the past. So this gave me a lot of power to sort of think through the fact that this work and these records did exist. And it gave me a bit of a push to sort of go out and look for additional content. So transforming the city into a navigable, immersive repository, Meteor of Toronto underscores the notion of where the archive itself is located. So how we shape the city is increasingly becoming a data-driven endeavor. I obviously don't have to tell any of you folks that. And we're no longer focused solely on built infrastructure. Like many other cities, Toronto is now composed of metadata that impacts its systems, cultural institutions, and neighborhoods alike. The data has the potential to become translated by software, which in turn perpetuates lasting impacts on how the city is experienced, managed, and subsequently governed. With Meteor of Toronto, the smartphone itself interprets the city through a visual perspective, through this idea of what I call a digital deja vu, to reimagine spatial memories. In this way, the archive embedded within the city is remediated into the city itself as an archive. And so augmented reality helps us play with this idea where the city itself is sort of translated by our phones, and we can see this content brought to life as we move through the city. Now, the sort of final focal point of my work is really focused on this idea that archives trace the roots of an individual, a person, or a place into the past, whereas augmented reality sort of traces it into the future and projects it into the future for our navigation. So my work contextualizes this sort of augmented reality experience as an augmented encounter. Now, these experiences represent more than simple information delivery. They immerse the user into a mutually constituted relationship that aligns the technology, the content that they're seeing through their phone screen, their bodies as they orient themselves towards that content, and then the physical world. So apps like this that make use of augmented reality, they're sort of designed for engagement. They require the user to participate, to move, and to act in order to gain spatial knowledge. And so I characterize this idea of this movement as augmented Flannery, which sort of has origins in the sort of Parisian figure who sort of was really attracted to the city, the sounds, the smells, the tastes, and the sort of just general terrain of the city. And I'm really interested in how we reshape cities and how we tell the stories of cities over time. So here the screen itself acts as a navigational agent, alerting the user to visual records found around them, which cultivates a unique relationship with the landscape as the content is dually invisible and also pervasive. While most museums and archive urge the user to look at content that's in front of them and not away, augmented reality urges the user to disrupt their gaze and to experience the content beyond the confines of the walls or frames. So ideally, you're looking at this content in space, but you're also looking at what's around and what has changed, right? And so it kind of makes you think of these childhood spot the difference puzzles and sometimes puzzles you find in magazines, where you're looking at some of the general differences that exist. So just really quickly, because I know I'm already over time, I'll talk very briefly about some of the contributions that the work makes. So for me, the idea was never to sort of replace traditional archives or museums. What I really wanted to do was sort of find a way to move institutions outside of their four walls and onto public space. I think that this is a really sort of important pivotal moment for cultural heritage institutions, especially during the pandemic. We can see that digital media, mobile exhibitions, and sort of site-specific installations are really having their heyday. And so I think it's important to continue to contribute to that and also to open up to public engagement so that folks can continue to do that work themselves as well. For me, I think it's also quite important to be able to trace your own historical narratives within a city, which is, something that I think is really important for a lot of people in Toronto, particularly folks that have been here for a long time. And so I think that curiosity and what the technology affords is really, really important. I think it's also worth noting that Meteor of Toronto hasn't been designed to replace these ideas, but to really empower citizens to trace their records and to contribute to altering our relations to the city. So these are just some of the images that I've collected from participants. And I think for me, what it does is it allows for a bit more of an inclusive approach to archiving, to public and social memory. And then ultimately, it sort of allows people to have a voice within the city. So seeing Meteor of Toronto exist as a prototype, it's not live yet for those of you that may have searched for it. For me, I think it confidently sort of provides a three-dimensional response to traditional academic archival research. It serves as an example of what I believe research should do, which is foster actionable changes and sort of create solutions to problems through design, participation, and collaboration. So it would have been possible for me to just write a long report about what the gaps were in institutional archives across the city and the nation more broadly, but I felt like creating a solution that folks could interact with and also could submit to would create a much more impactful solution. So for me, that's kind of where the project ended up. And again, it is something that I'm continuing to work on. That marks the conclusion of my presentation. I just wanted to say thank you for allowing me to share my work with you.